What's the bare minimum stuff you need for an electric car conversion? In this second part of my EV technology mini-series, I'm going to take a look at what components you'll need in a minimalist electric car conversion. This video is part of my Putting the EV in 7 project, where we're taking an unloved 10-year-old Caterham 7 drift car and converting it to be an electric vehicle. We're removing the internal combustion engine and putting in an electric motor, batteries and control electronics to create an EV interpretation of the classic 1957 pocket rocket. At the end of which, we hope to be able to say whether converting such an iconic car really is an appealing option for future conversions. As the project progresses, there'll be a mixture of these explainer videos along with the usual progress videos. But it's these first videos that I'll keep asking you to come back to if you want to know what's in this EV project and what some widget or other does. These explainer videos are going to be relatively technical, so I'll try and keep the content to about high school level physics. If you're a more advanced viewer, please just accept that I've applied a layer of gloss to the basics, and then let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see any more of these videos with more in-depth theory. The first explainer video was all about the differences between AC and DC used in an EV, while in this second video we'll now take a look at the components we'll need to use in the conversion and how they interact with each other. At that point, we should have all the basic principles of a no-frills EV nailed down, and we can then get back to the actual progress of my project car. And if this is your first time watching this series, then my intro videos will give you some of the why I do this along with the background to the project. For our ultra cut down EV conversion, we're going to need a few core components on our block diagram. Firstly, a motor to make us move, transmission to get the correct wheel speed and drive to the wheels, an inverter to drive the motor, battery pack to store all our propulsion energy, battery management system to control the battery pack, charging circuitry to get new energy into the vehicle, cooling to stop it all overheating, and safety circuitry to keep the vehicle and us safe. We'll cover each of these in the following sections, but you can also skip ahead using the chapter markers. So let's get into it and take a look at the minimum components needed for an EV conversion. The motor is probably the first component that needs to be decided upon in a conversion. But whilst it might be the first decision to drop out of the design, in reality, the process of deciding on the components is a back and forth between performance, availability, cost, and space planning. It will depend heavily on your project goals as to what the relative priorities are, but for me, the motor was the critical decision, setting many of the other parameters. The motor is what turns the energy stored in the battery pack into forces that drive the wheels. As we saw in the first video of this series, the motor takes three-phase electrical energy from the battery through an inverter and turns it into rotational energy. The mainly adopted motor type for EVs is permanent magnet synchronous motors, or PMSMs. A permanent magnet synchronous motor has two main parts, a stator and a rotor. The stator forms the outer casing of the motor, and the rotor fills a cylindrical cavity inside it. By passing an alternating current through coils in the stator, we create a magnetic field which has both north and south poles that attract and repel the magnetic poles of the rotor magnets, which pushes and pulls the rotor around. The frequency of the sine waves is what governs the speed that the rotor will turn at, and we'll come to this again when we talk about the inverter later. Electric motors also perform quite differently to ICE, internal combustion engines. They create a large peak torque from standstill and happily operate to many thousands of revolutions per minute. They're a perfect option for producing power from standstill all the way up to whatever maximum speed we need for our vehicle. This also means we don't need a traditional multi-ratio gearbox to offset the narrow, high-revving power and torque curves of an internal combustion engine. We're saving weight on a complicated gearbox and a bunch of other associated stuff. It's also worth pointing out that an electric motor is not 100% efficient. For instance, the resistance in the coiled stator wiring creates heat. If the motor is generating a lot of power, then this heat created in the stator may require the motor to be cooled. So we've seen how the speed of the motor is governed by the frequency of the sine wave currents we apply to the stator. The final part of this motor puzzle is how we translate accelerator pedal position to motor speed and torque. Okay, now hold on to your hats. We're going to get a bit technical. So we can see how the accelerator pedal turns into increased torque. I'm going to artificially stall the rotor, but keep the stator currents flowing. This shouldn't ever happen in practice, but it'll be helpful for us to see what's going on. So we say that pedal position equates to a parameter that we call demand, and then we set demand to be proportional to the torque requested from the motor. When we press the accelerator pedal, the inverter increases the current in the stator windings, which in turn increases the magnetic field produced by the stator. This then creates a larger force between the stator magnetic field and the rotor permanent magnets. And finally, we know that torque is just force times distance. This increased torque can do a couple of things for us. Firstly, the extra torque can increase the speed of the motor and therefore the vehicle. Secondly, it also translates into the motor working harder at the current speed. And that's what you need if, for instance, you're going up a hill. There are many other nuances about how the stator and the rotor interact with each other, like back EMF and field weakening, but we'll leave them to a future video. So let's recap on where we've got to with motors. Permanent magnet synchronous motors have a stator with coils that create a magnetic field which interacts with the permanent magnets installed in the rotor. The three-phase AC currents in the stator coils change thousands of times a second to push and pull the rotor with a force that makes the vehicle move. The frequency of the stator sine waves controls the speed of the motor, and we also saw that the amount of current we apply to the stator windings determines the torque produced by the motor. Which brings us to the next component in our EV, the so-called e-transmission. So our motors run at high RPM and only have one output shaft. To overcome those two issues, we need some sort of gear reduction system on the output of the motor and a differential to split the drive from one shaft to two that will run the wheels on both sides of the car. If we manage things well, then the differential and the motor output reduction can be handled by a single transmission component that gets called an e-transmission. In my conversion, I need a wheel speed of around 1900 RPM to get to a vehicle speed for track use, which is about 125 miles an hour. Clearly way faster than you can use on regular roads, but not unreasonable for track use. Now let's look at the electronics we need to drive the motor. The job of an EV inverter is mainly to convert direct current to three-phase alternating current, taking energy from the battery and feeding it to the motor. It is also used to do the reverse when the motor is generating, converting three-phase AC back to DC and putting it back into the battery pack. Now, to create the three AC sine wave, an inverter will use a chopping design, where it switches the battery's DC voltage on and off to create what is known as a chopped output. The timing of this chopping action is performed precisely so as to create an approximate sine wave. This is then smoothed to produce the final sine wave, which can be applied to the motor. Three sine waves are created by the inverter, each offset by 1/3 of a cycle. In the motor we'll be using, those AC sine waves will be cycling at about 500 Hz, but the switching, chopping frequency of the inverter will perhaps be up at around 40 times that frequency, or around 20 kHz. We also saw how it creates the sine waves at the right frequency and current needed to control the motor. To control this rapidly spinning rotor and quickly changing sine waves, the inverter needs to know more of what's actually going on with the position of the motor's rotor. To do this, the most common solution is to use what is known as a resolver, incorporated into the motor. The output of the resolver is then fed into the inverter and added to all the maths being performed there. We won't get into the detail of this maths, known as digital signal processing or DSP, but it's worth mentioning that the inverter DSP is continuously checking the rotor's position, stator currents, demand and torque and comparing them against what it thinks they should be. It then adjusts the stator currents to compensate for any changes, doing that many thousands of times a second. Another side note here is that while the transistors used to chop up the DC into AC are very efficient, they're not 100% efficient. They have a small amount of resistance when they're on and conducting current. And because the currents are so large in an EV, that means the transistors dissipate a lot of power, and power means heat. So this is another area where cooling is usually required to keep the transistors from getting too hot. The battery pack is what stores all the energy to make our vehicle move. It's stored in the battery as electrochemical energy, and in the case of the lithium-ion batteries that we'll be using, Charging or discharging the battery physically moves lithium ions between the positive and negative sides of the battery. When we want to go somewhere in our vehicle, we convert the chemical energy back into electrical energy, which we then apply to the motor to make us go forwards and backwards. We can also charge the battery up by using regenerative braking and turning a bit of our speed, our kinetic energy, back into electrical and then chemical energy again. A battery is made up of many hundreds or thousands of smaller batteries called cells. Cells in series increase the voltage, cells in parallel increase the current, and we need the correct voltage to drive the motor efficiently while having enough current to deliver the total power we want. The total energy the battery can store, its capacity, measured in kilowatt hours, determines our range. And how full the battery is what we call its state of charge. And while batteries are pretty good at storing and delivering electrical energy, they also, like everything else we're talking about, are not 100% efficient. They create heat as they operate. And with the high power throughput of an EV battery pack, then a pumped cooling system will also be required to keep battery temperatures in check. An EV has another controller brain, known as the Battery Management System, or BMS. Lithium cells are not as forgiving as lead-acid batteries used in the low-voltage systems of internal combustion engine vehicles. To keep them healthy, lithium cells need to be charged and discharged carefully, and to do so, the BMS monitors the voltage, current, and temperature of the vehicle's battery packs. When the motor is running, the BMS will communicate with the inverter, informing it if it thinks the battery pack is too hot and telling the inverter that it needs to back off on the power it's telling the motor to deliver. It's done to keep the batteries as healthy as possible and to increase their longevity. The BMS also has another trick up its sleeve when managing battery health. It can also call for the batteries to be cooled by a coolant circuit. Managing the temperature of the batteries is not just about trying to keep them cool. As well as a cooling radiator, the battery coolant circuit may also have a heating element incorporated to bring the battery pack's temperature up to improve both health and charging times. I'm going to break the charging down into 4 sections: regenerative charging, onboard low-power AC charging, high-powered DC charging, and onboard low-voltage charging. We'll also talk about the charging socket while we're at it. Regenerative braking is one we've already talked about, but that doesn't bring new energy into the car, so we'll concentrate here on new power being added with low-power AC and high-power DC charging. Onboard charging is often included via a low-power but slow AC to DC charger. It takes AC grid power into the car and converts it to DC to be fed into the vehicle's propulsion battery pack. This method is best used for overnight street-side or home charging. We may or may not include one of these in our project. The second new energy charging method is to use a roadside DC to DC charger that takes power from a charging station and directly charges the high-voltage propulsion battery. With this method, there's a large roadside box that converts grid alternating current into direct current for the car. These fast and super-fast DC chargers feed the vehicle with exactly the voltage the propulsion battery pack needs, meaning the vehicle doesn't do any voltage conversion when taking high voltage DC to charge the car. The vehicle's BMS and charging controller make sure the charger provides both the correct voltage and current for the car. Both need to be monitored to make sure the power being delivered doesn't compromise battery health or longevity. From our perspective, DC fast charging will be important. We will need to charge on long journeys or on track days, and we don't want to be sat waiting for a slow onboard charge to finish. While we're talking about charging, we need to discuss a side issue. EVs also have a low voltage DC to DC converter in the vehicle. It takes power from the propulsion battery pack and charges a low voltage battery. This battery is then used to power the ancillaries such as lights, wipers, horns and pumps. You might think that with a large high voltage propulsion battery sitting in the car and all the high voltage power electronics floating about, you wouldn't need a low voltage battery in an EV. Well, that turns out not to be the case for the following reasons. Firstly, it's much simpler to reuse all the low voltage ancillaries, especially in a conversion like ours. Secondly, if the high voltage battery fails or runs flat, then you need a backup battery to run your safety functions such as hazard warning lights and your main lights. Finally, If you do manage to flatten your high voltage propulsion battery pack, then it would be a good idea if the car had another source of energy to power all the electronics needed to reliably kickstart the charging session again. It therefore makes sense to have a separate low voltage battery in the car, and this is where a DC to DC converter comes in. And to finish off the discussion about charging, let's talk about the charging socket. And I'm talking here about the CCS, or common charging socket, that's used across Europe now. The charging socket allows for both low power AC and high power DC charging. It also provides a locking mechanism to stop you or somebody else from removing the charging plug in the middle of a charge. So that's all the charging and voltage conversion covered. Let's have a look at cooling. Highly efficient electrical drive systems were supposed to do away with the mucky stuff of oil and coolant in ICE cars. But while many people doing EV conversions would rather ignore it, the reality is that high-power drivetrains still generate a lot of waste heat. It would be nice to think that they could be air-cooled, but unfortunately, even with the efficiencies in the 95+% range, they're still generating tens of kilowatts of waste heat at full throttle. Let's finally talk about a catch-all category that I've lumped together and called HV safety and wiring. This is a category that is all-pervasive throughout the vehicle. It distributes both DC and AC power at hundreds of volts and hundreds of amps, while also being sent at quite high frequencies. There's a lot of power being distributed around an EV, and if you choose the wrong size wiring, then it's quite possible to lose a lot of that power just in resistance of those wires alone. But on the flip side, if you pick overly conservative wiring, meaning the wiring cross-section is too big, then you'll be carrying many extra kilograms of copper around for very little benefit. Most EV conversions have one or more boxes that house a few critical but otherwise disparate components. Included in this, we have things like pre-charge circuits that protect the inverter and motor when applying high voltage to the motor on startup, contactors that are fail-safe for a few areas of the car, interlock wiring that I'll talk about in a bit, and battery junction boxes. Contactors are essentially just high voltage relays, a switch, that either allows the flow of current or not, and can be used for both DC and AC systems. An EV will typically have contactors spread throughout its high voltage circuits, protecting both you and other parts of the car if faults or accidents occur. If you've ever started or stopped an EV or plugged one into charge, you'll have heard a loud click or series of clicks. This sound is the contactors opening or closing. Before you can move off in an EV, the car has to perform diagnostic tests and will only close the contactors if all of those tests pass. If any fault occurs while driving, or the vehicle is in an accident, then the vehicle's control systems will open the contactors to disconnect all the HV components from each other, which leads us to a very important concept in EV cars, interlocks. An interlock is often implemented as a long physical wire that connects through each of the EV's components, stringing from one device to the next in series. If the interlock wire is broken by fault, accident, or someone opening something at the wrong time, then the vehicle will open all the contactors and make it as safe as possible. This protection is a very physical system, with little or no electronics or software governing its action. That way, it will provide its protection in the most fault-tolerant, resilient way possible. And that's it for this rather long episode. We covered a lot of ground in this video, looking at all the major components of our EV conversion. We looked at how motors work and how they take electrical energy and convert it to rotational power. We then looked at the e-transmission we'll need to take the motor output and drive our wheels. After that, we looked at the inverter and how it creates the sine waves at the right frequency needed to power our motor. And then after the inverter, we looked at battery packs, how they are configured and how they work. Finally, we looked at charging, cooling and safety. Hopefully that will be enough EV technical background to get you through the coming progress videos, as well as being a video you'll be able to return to as we progress through the project. If you'd like a more in-depth version of anything I've covered here, then let me know in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to put a video together. Stay tuned, like and subscribe to see updates as they come out, and I'll see you next time when I'll definitely have started to do some converting.